One day into Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign, and he is already breaking records. Internal documents from the campaign found that he raised a record $5.9 million in small dollar donations in the first 24 hours of his campaign. The average donation amount, as you can guess, was the same $27 figure that Bernie Sanders made a key part of his 2016 campaign, with his daily reminders on the campaign trail that we're doing this $27 at a time. All this coming from around 220,000 donors in all 50 states. Another fact to note, these aren't just one-time donations. About half of these people also sign up to be monthly recurring donors to the campaign. So already, Bernie Sanders is amassing a formidable war chest that can last him well into the primaries. I want to say thank you to everyone across the country who donated to Bernie Sanders' campaign in the first day and who will continue to donate to his campaign throughout the primary. I've been saying since 2016 to anybody who would listen, when Bernie Sanders runs again in 2020, he will be an even greater political force than he was in 2016. I wasn't pulling this out of my ass, and I wasn't just saying this because I'm a Bernie Sanders fanboy. It's backed up by the numbers. It's backed up by the data. The amount of support that Bernie Sanders has from the grassroots in this country is unheard of. The network of supporters and volunteers that Bernie Sanders controls has only grown since 2016. Like I touched on in my analysis of his announcement, which I will link to in this video, Bernie Sanders didn't just pack up and go home or take a back seat after Donald Trump became president and the Republicans took control of the House and the Senate. Recently, he's been out front on so many important policy issues. He's actually made substantive gains and achievements on progressive policy priorities. And there's a very big distinction between what he's been doing and what some of these other candidates in the primary are trying to do now. A lot of these other candidates who are running, like Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, and I'd honestly even throw in Elizabeth Warren into that category. Right now they're trying to boost their credibility by introducing legislation that they think would gain them support among the base during the primary. But Bernie has been doing this since day one of the Trump administration. He was pushing his policy agenda from right after Hillary Clinton lost the election to Donald Trump, and he wasted no time. I spoke about his relentless advocacy on the issue of Medicare for All and how he changed the entire national discussion to where we are now. Over 70% of the country, including Republicans and independents, support a Medicare for All healthcare system. Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna got Amazon and Disney to agree to raise the minimum wage within their companies to $15 an hour, giving hundreds of thousands of people a desperately needed raise. In a huge win for the anti-war movement, for the first time in U.S. history, Bernie Sanders got a Republican Senate to vote to end an illegal, unauthorized war, a genocide that we're carrying out in Yemen right now. So when the base sees this, when the grassroots of the country and the progressive activists see this, the very people who are fighting for the same policy goals, well, with these actions, he just automatically wins them over. Because they know he's not bullshitting them. They know this isn't just campaign rhetoric or some kabuki theater or some legislation that he really doesn't expect to get passed. They know that he actually cares about these issues and implementing these policy goals. Which is why the day that he announces that he's running for president, he can garner $6 million in donations from over 220,000 supporters across the country. Like I said, we've been watching his actions over the entire Trump administration. They know he's the real deal Evander Holyfield. So real progressives and grassroots organizers did not hesitate for a second to throw their support behind Bernie Sanders. So now the mainstream media doesn't know what to do with this information. Because typically, the only metric that they use to judge whether or not a candidate has viability is how much money that they can raise. So now that they see that Bernie Sanders is clearly blowing out all the establishment favorites in the area of fundraising, they don't know how to act. Now you have establishment hacks at the Washington Post who usually worship and revere fundraising totals, saying that, well, just because he raised a lot of money, that doesn't mean he's actually going to win the primary. To me personally, I don't think that money is the only indicator that tells whether or not a candidate has viability. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proved that theory when she beat corporate tool Joe Crowley, who outraised her 10-1 in their election. But it's notable in this case seeing how that money came from small dollar donations from across the country, so it's a measure of how much and widespread the support that he has is. So it's amazing to see how they just flip on a dime the minute that the numbers and the data that they typically use to predict who the front runner will be, when that data is indicating that Bernie Sanders will be that front runner. Because like I've been saying since the beginning of the show, the mainstream media has a clear establishment bias. So they will almost never admit Bernie Sanders stands a very, very good chance of winning the 2020 election. Because that contradicts the narrative that they've been pushing for decades. That the entire country is actually very centrist, center-right, and they view progressives and social democrats as extreme and fringe. Well, that can't be the case if Bernie Sanders, who was a champion of those policies and those ideologies, is now the clear frontrunner. All those policies that he fights for, they would consider fringe. Medicare for all, a $15 minimum wage, free college, ending the wars, a universal daycare plan for all children across the country, mandatory paid vacation time by law. They considered all these things fringe and way too far left. The campaign is already melting their brains and having them do ridiculous mental gymnastics to convince people that Bernie Sanders is not the frontrunner, when clearly his fundraising totals contradict that narrative.